Hello, everyone. Good afternoon, and welcome to the Global Catholic Climate Movement Canada chapter, our LiveLauditoSi learning webinar called In Solidarity with Migrants. This Zoom call is recorded, and it will be available for viewing afterwards. We'll send out a link to that. Everyone is muted as they come into the webinar, and I ask if you have questions to please post them in the chat box. My thanks to Mr. Joe Gunn, who's watching the chat box and fielding your questions to us at the end after our speakers have both had a chance to answer some questions in an interview style today. At each one of our webinars, I begin with a land acknowledgement, and this is the land acknowledgement that I will use. GCCM Canada is a project of faith in the common good and acknowledges that our projects from coast to coast to coast are on traditional territories of diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. We seek to live in respect, peace, and right relations, and are mindful of broken covenants. By making a land acknowledgement, we are taking part in an act of reconciliation, honoring the land and Indigenous heritage which dates back over 10,000 years. As a community, we have the responsibility to honor, care for, and respect all that Creator God gives to provide us with life. This includes the land, water, air, fire, animals, plants, and our ancestors. And I'd also like to begin with a prayer, if you would join me. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit, amen. Prayer for migrants and refugees and asylum seekers. God, no one is stranger to you, and no one is ever far from your loving care. In your kindness, watch over migrants, refugees, and asylum seekers, those separated from their loved ones, those who are lost, and those who have been exiled from their homes. Bring them safely to the place where they long to be, and help us always to show your kindness to strangers and those in need. We ask this through Christ our Lord, who too was a refugee and migrant who traveled to another land searching for a home. Amen. In the name of the Father, and of the Holy Spirit, amen. And that is from the Ignatian Solidarity Network, and they sourced the Newen Network for that one. I'd like to take a minute now to introduce our speakers. Deacon Rudy Ovcjak is Director of the Archdiocese of Toronto Office for Refugees. It is Canada's largest private refugee sponsor. They settle hundreds of refugees each year, and an important part of their work includes conducting overseas missions where it selects refugees who have no hope of government sponsorship. These selected refugees are matched with parishes throughout the Archdiocese of Toronto, whose members welcome and assist them as they begin their new life in Canada. Deacon Rudy holds a Bachelor of Applied Arts, a degree in Geography from Ryerson, and a Master's of Business Administration from the University of Western Ontario. In 2010, he was ordained a Roman Catholic deacon and serves at his parish of St. Isaac Jogues. I'm not sure if I said that right. Our second speaker, Stephen Kaduuli, is the Refugee Rights Policy Analyst at Citizens for Public Justice, a national organization inspired by faith to act for justice. CPJ equips and engages communities and individuals to participate in advocacy on key issues, especially around refugee rights, climate justice, and poverty in Canada. Stephen holds a Bachelor of Arts degree in social work from Makerere University in Uganda and a Master of Arts in Demography from the Australian National University in Canberra. He served as a civil servant in Uganda for several years before coming to Canada as a visiting researcher for the Center for Refugee Studies at York University. He also worked with the Diocese of Hamilton and was involved in processing and welcoming refugees in Hamilton. In 2019, he joined the Citizens for Public Justice. So, welcome everyone, and welcome to our speakers. Thank you very much for joining us today. As I mentioned, this is going to take part in an interview process. And I will start with my questions for Rudy. Rudy, could you, Deacon Rudy, can you summarize for us some global statistics regarding refugee and environmental migrants?
Sure, happy to do that. I'm going to, just to answer that, I'm going to share a screen and it shows statistics, the most recent statistics taken provided to us by the UNHCR, the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. And so I think this is as of June of last year. And what it shows is that we have 80 million people, over 80 million people forcibly displaced worldwide. 46 million of them are internally displaced persons, meaning they have had to flee their homes because of war or violence or persecution, natural disaster, and have had to relocate elsewhere within their country of origin, within their country of citizenship. In addition to that, we have over 26 million persons who are bona fide refugees. So they've not only had to flee from their home, but from their homeland. And the one significant takeaway is just the enormity of this global refugee crisis. And as the slide reads, the size of the current global migrant crisis is comparable to that the world faced the world at the end of World War II. It is enormous in size.
Thank you. So you've pointed out here that there is a difference in what is recognized as refugees who cross the borders of countries and those who are displaced within their own country. Can you tell us about what those distinctions mean and how environmental migrants are considered internationally?
Yeah. I think that's, it is important to understand the definition of a refugee, first of all. And so let me read you the definition that is used by our Immigration Refugee Board here in Canada. It says a convention refugee is a person who, by reason of a well-founded fear of persecution for reasons of race, religion, nationality, membership in a particular social group, or political opinion, has been forced to flee, and I'm using my own words here, from their country of origin, and is unable, or by reason of that fear, is unwilling to avail themselves of the protection of their country of origin. And so that's this very specific definition, internationally known and kind of followed by the signatories of the 1951 Geneva Convention. It excludes those that are internally displaced, and it excludes and climate change related migrants. And so the implication of this is through refugee resettlement programs that are in operation in various Western governments, including Canada's and the United States, we are not able to assist those that are IDPs, internally displaced persons, or climate change related migrants. And so they are excluded from refugee resettlement programs.
I've heard the term economic migrants as applying to environmental migrants. Are those synonymous?
No. Well, there's if you look at there's a tremendous amount of overlap between those two, but they are not identical. So it depends on the particular situation that the refugee is, that the migrant is fleeing from. So they might just be in a state of looking to improve the economic status of their family, right? To look for a better life, and not necessarily being driven to do so because of climate change related issues. It could be just domestic poverty that they're fleeing from. Some of that might be tied to climate change, but not necessarily so. And so, I mean, we see a stark example of this taking place at the southern border of the United States. And I think the last statistics that I heard was it was in the neighborhood of about 95 to 98% of those that have entered into the United States claiming asylum are deemed to be economic migrants. And the impact of that is that because they're claiming refugee asylum, and because they don't meet the definition of a refugee, they are asked to leave the United States.
Okay. Can you put this understanding of refugees in context with the Catholic Church and what our church says about refugees and environmental migrants? And I know that, you know, Pope Francis has said a lot about it, and Fratelli Tutti, his latest encyclical, addresses it specifically. Can you share some of that with us? Sure.
Fratelli Tutti had a couple of sections where it talks about kind of our response to environmental migration and refugees in general. And there's a number of chapters that relate to an absence of human dignity at the border. So that's one section that he speaks at length about our need to, as you know, as nation states, to resist the impulse of what he quotes as populist political regimes to prevent migrants from coming into the country at all costs. So he says we need to resist that impulse. But at the same time, he says that there also needs to be not only a welcome of migrants that are fleeing from very difficult situations, and particularly those that are fleeing from war and persecution and natural disasters, right? So that typical definition of a refugee. We have to be open and welcoming to them. Now, it's important to recognize that the size of the global refugee crisis, 26 million refugees, that the West is incapable, as welcoming as they are, as welcoming as Canada and Europe and the United States are, it is incapable of welcoming all 26 million refugees. So this is, but, to welcome those that are most vulnerable. But he also says later on in that section, there's also a need to reaffirm the right not to emigrate, that is to remain in one's homeland. So he's walking a very fine balance, right? So you have this influx of economic migrants coming in, again, southern border of the United States. I think one of the things that needs to be looked at is the root causes that have forced these migrants to flee, and address those root causes so that they were able to have a reasonable kind of economic existence in their homeland. Then he talks about reciprocal gifts, right? The value of that refugees that are welcomed into Western governments, the value that they bring to the society that welcomes them. And I come from a refugee background. So my father fled to Canada after the Second World War when the communists took over Yugoslavia. Slovenia was his mother country, as well as my mother. And that whole generation that came after the Second World War, and there include the Poles, the Slovaks, the Italians, the Slovenians, they all came and they had such a tremendous impact on the fabric of Canadian society. And I think this is what the Pope is referring to, these wonderful gifts of culture and ingenuity and all that refugees bring. They are gifts to the countries that welcome them. So I think those are the two most important kind of takeaways from Fratelli Tutti as it relates to migrants.
There's a lot there. Can you tell us a little bit about how Canadian dioceses are helping international refugees, and how we're working with governments to improve settlement outcomes?
Sure. I mean, this is, Canada has an absolute, in fact, the church has a tremendous track record of helping refugees. The Cardinal has asked me to be his delegate on the International Catholic Migration Commission. So this is I know it's a very technical term. It's entitled a public juridical body. And so it has special status in the eyes of the church, right? For example, bylaws, their constitution and bylaws needs to be approved by the Secretary of State of the Vatican. That's how integral this organization, the status that it's given in the light of the church. That was created in response by Pope Pius XII in response to the refugee crisis at the end of the Second World War, right? So we've had a fabulous track record. We see this tremendous leadership by Pope Francis. The fact that the Migrants and Refugees section, headed by our own Canadian Jesuit, Cardinal Tierney, and the Scalabrinian priest, Father Baggio, as undersecretaries, they report directly to Pope Francis. That's how important this issue of migrants and refugees is in the eyes of Pope Francis and of the church. And it is true here in Canada as well. Refugees have played, the church's involvement in addressing the plight of refugees has been in existence for the past 40 some odd years. The church in Canada has been instrumental in their involvement in the private sponsorship of refugees program. It is a phenomenal program, right? This came into being at the height of the Indochina refugee crisis, the Vietnamese boat people, when they were coming over. The Canadian government said, we need to be able to help these people. And so they launched this private sponsorship of refugees program that leverages the time, talent, and treasure of ordinary Canadians, right? So as a private sponsor, we receive no monies from the Canadian government. It is by the generosity of parishioners across the Archdiocese that we are able to do this work. And so there's three different streams of private sponsorship, streams within the umbrella of private sponsors. You have the group of 5, community sponsorship, and sponsorship agreement holders. And it is that last tranche of sponsorship agreement holders that we participate in, that the Church in Canada participates in. We sign an agreement with Immigration Canada, with the government, that allows us to name our own refugees. And we probably represent, there's probably about 125 sponsorship agreement holders across Canada. And the Catholic Church in Canada represents probably about 20 to 25 of that. So we play a very significant role in sponsoring refugees, and have over the course of the last 40 years. In the last 10 years, our Diocese of Toronto has been able to successfully resettle more than 5,000 refugees. Like that, in the global scheme of things, that's a small drop in the bucket. But if you think of it in the terms of Canadian society, 5,000 people, that's like a small town in Ontario. I mean, that's significant. And that's at the cost of regular people throughout the Archdiocese. Those families that are sponsoring their own family members and from parish communities. So it's, we should be very proud as Catholics, as the Church, that we have been and continue to be actively involved in addressing the plight of refugees across the world.
And I know the Archdiocese of Toronto is the largest diocese, the largest private sponsor, but many dioceses across the country. Like I'm in Hamilton, and we sponsored many Syrian refugees recently, and I know in Saskatchewan and in Vancouver, there are very active dioceses with regard to refugee resettlement that come close seconds to Toronto.
Well, you know, we work collaboratively. So there's an umbrella organization that we formed as Catholic SAWs, that we collaborate, we share best practices, we provide counsel to one another and support each other in our advocacy efforts. One of the items that you asked me about was integration outcomes. And here's the beauty of the PSR program, the Private Sponsorship of Refugees program. There was a study a few years ago that looked at Syrian refugees brought into Canada, and they compared those that were brought in by the government and those that were brought in by private sponsors. And those that were brought in by the government and settled by the government, 90% of those refugees went on social assistance in year 2 and beyond. That's an absolutely failure. in my opinion, of integration. You compare that against private sponsored refugees, and we see that privately sponsored refugees, 55% of them are standing on their own 2 feet financially, contributing to Canadian society in their first year of settlement. We welcome and journey with them during that first year. And to have 55% of them, established and contributing and building their family and their new life is a phenomenal outcome. I wish it was higher, but it's a whole lot better than what we see in the government-sponsored refugee program. And here's the reason why. It is because when a refugee comes in and is sponsored by a private sponsor, they're either welcomed by their family or by a community, like a parish community, right? Our parish is generally a parish community that has a refugee committee, has between 5 and 15 volunteers that work, welcome and journey with that refugee 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. And usually those relationships go well into year 2, 3, and for a long time afterwards. Under the government program, they have one settlement agency worker, one government worker sponsoring and helping between 15 and 25 refugee families at one time. So this is the reason.
It's a big difference. The level of care and the level of welcoming is quite different. Deacon Rudy, thank you. I'm going to have to move to Stephen and ask him a few questions. Thank you very much for the insights that you've given us on the global numbers and what's happening here in Canada, especially what the church is doing. Stephen.
Yes, please.
Welcome today.
Thank you, Agnes.
Can you tell us where in the world right now people are on the move due to environmental degradation, either from a specific storm or from ongoing cumulative effects of climate disruption?
Thank you. I'll start with a brief statistic. In the first half of last year, 2020, disasters displaced 9.8 million people globally, and they're continuing triggering new internal displacements. The places where environmental degradation has pushed people to move include India. There are 2.7 million who were forced to move in the past year. In Bangladesh, it is 2.5, Philippines, over 800,000, China, almost 800,000, and Somalia, 500,000. Most of the disaster displacements were a result of tropical storms and monsoon rains. That is in Southern Asia. In the Pacific, we have a more worrying situation where climate change is warming oceans and melting ice sheets, leading to sea level rise. 8 Pacific islands have already been submerged, and 2 will soon be submerged. Some of these islands are Kepidau and Pelang, Nalap, Liap, Natik, and Ross. So many people have been forced to relocate permanently. Then we have Kiribati. It is on the way to becoming the first country to be swallowed by the sea due to climate change. That is why the face of climate migrants, a gentleman called Ione Teitota, fled Kiribati in 2010, and he has become sort of a climate celebrity. He was denied status in New Zealand. His case went up to the UN, and that's why the UN ruled that it is not right for people fleeing climate change to be sent back to their countries. In Central America, it's getting hotter and drier. At the same time, they're experiencing heavier floods. They have a multi-year drought, which are forcing particularly Guatemalans, Hondurans, and Salvadorans to head north to US probably. And then in sub-Saharan Africa, we had displacements also in Ethiopia, Somalia, Mozambique. The highest recorded displacement was due to cyclones Idai and Kenneth. It was the first time in a recorded history for two cyclones to hit a country in the same season, Cyclone Idai and Kenneth. And in Canada, as the earth warms up, prairie droughts are the main challenge that climate change will pose to Canada.
Thank you. Climate change, droughts, but I think too the Arctic and the incredibly fast rate that the Arctic is warming is also maybe not necessarily causing people to leave, but certainly changing their lifestyles. There's no doubt. Stephen, can you tell us about the backlog in Canada for processing and settling refugees and what's causing that backlog?
Right. According to the Sponsorship Agreement Holders Association, the latest figure we have is that the backlog is over 50,000 applications, and it is growing. This has been occasioned by the pandemic. Prior to the pandemic, the backlog was being handled in a better manner. It was going down, but when the pandemic came, we are going back up again. The causes of this perennial, I would call it perennial backlog, is due to the number of applicants being more than the spots that are allocated for sponsorship each year.
And this is both government and private, right?
Mostly private.
Oh, okay.
Because there are very few government-sponsored refugees. It's mostly private. Yeah. And then the Syrian crisis also led a surge to interest in private sponsorship. More people became aware of sponsoring refugees and the need to sponsor refugees. So more people started applying to sponsor refugees. So the focus of sponsorship shifted to Syrian refugees because the Canadian government promised to bring in 25,000 Syrian refugees by 2015, 2016. So other visa missions, there was a slowdown in their processing speeds, so their backlogs went up as all the concentration was on Syrian refugees. And then there are delays that happen at visa missions because of lack of adequate manpower, technology, and resources. Then the application process is a bit too complex for some refugees and their sponsors, and that leads to delays. And then other delays occur at the Central Processing Office here in Canada. If any application has an error and it is sent to the Central Processing Office, the whole package is normally sent back to the visa office, and the whole process can be repeated several times. Yeah, for more information on this, you can look at CPJ's A Half Welcome Report and the Continuing Welcome Report, which air out all these issues in detail.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. It's a complicated system, there's no doubt. And you know, some of the complications are where our staff are in other places where people are applying, and some of the complications are here and the resources that we have. I'm going to take us on a little bit of a tangent right now, but can you maybe address how well are Canadians who are displaced within our own country, when we're displaced by climate disasters, able to recover and cope compared to people who are displaced by similar disasters in other places?
People who are displaced by climate disasters in Canada are more able to bounce back. They are more able to cope because Canada has the resources. It is a wealthy country. It is easy for it to adapt to climate-related stressors. And much worse for people in poorer countries where there are no resources, no infrastructure. However, this climate change is taking a growing toll on First Nations by depleting their food sources and affecting their health. According to one human rights report, the government is not adequately supporting First Nations efforts to adapt to the mounting crisis and is failing to do its part to reduce greenhouse emissions that are driving it. The real solution is to address the climate crisis, food poverty, to protect the First Nations traditional territories and food sources. Otherwise, Canada is in a better position than most countries.
Mm-hmm. And Canada supporting our First Nations and the right to clean water is part of that. But I think also how we respond with our international aid and our commitments to the Paris Climate Accord to, you know, pay our fair share when it comes to helping others adapt. That sort of segues into my next question for you, Stephen, is what is, if you were to think of one best thing that Canadians can do to help environmental migrants, what would it be?
To help environmental migrants?
Yes.
The best thing for them to do would be to educate themselves about the causes of environmental migration, to advocate their government against those, to fight against those causes, and to assist other nations which are less endowed with infrastructure to fight climate change.
So financial supports and technological supports in terms of how they can manage.
Exactly.
Fantastic.
And we have to do this because we contribute a lot to the greenhouse gases, and we enjoy better life. And the greenhouse gases do not know boundaries, they don't know borders. They affect the whole earth. So we have a duty, we owe it to other countries to support them in the mitigation efforts against climate change, the vagaries of climate change.
Thank you. Thank you. There's a lot to think about. And I think what this conversation points out is that we are so interconnected globally in so many ways. The refugee crisis and what's causing people to move is one of many. And often in the webinars that GCCM Canada runs, it comes back to the same thing, that we need to take action and ask for stronger government action around climate change here and around the world. So I'm just going to check in with the chat box and see.
I would also add something.
Yes.
They should also look at our campaign on the CPJ website. where they can do some advocacy on some of these issues. It is for the Love of Creation 2021, for the Love of Creation campaign. It will guide Canadians how to advocate for better handling of climate issues by government.
Thank you. That is one of the questions that were asked by our audience is what campaigns are on the books right now. We are going to take part in one at the end of this webinar. So there is For Love of Creation's campaign, which I will put up a slide for everyone to see how to connect with that campaign. But there is an international movement that tomorrow is the International Day of Action for Sacred People, Sacred Earth. And when you were sent the login for today's webinar, I asked you to print off a poster in support of that campaign. And they have 10 demands. One of them is hospitality for migrants. And this is faith communities asking their leaderships and governments all around the world to support each of these 10 demands that they have in their Sacred People, Sacred Earth campaign. And there are a few others that I can tell you about towards the end. So I'm just going to see. Let's see. I have another question for both of you. Sorry, Rudy, were you aware of any campaigns that were that are available in Canada that Catholics and people can join?
That specifically address the climate change issue, and I'm not aware of any at this time.
Another question is, Canada's overseas development assistance budget is the lowest in 50 years when considered as a percentage of our economy. This does not help people remain in their homes. We have never met any climate target that we have set, yet we plan to take 400,000 immigrants in this year. Aren't Canadian policies contradictory? And that is a question for both of you.
I actually did a slide. So in 2019, the Migrants and Refugees section hosted a consultation to look at climate change related displacement. And so I was able to provide a presentation, submit a presentation to them. And I did look at Canada's participation in the Paris Accord. And this is, I'm not sure, maybe if I can share this slide again, that would be, I think that might be helpful. So bear with me for a sec. And I'll see if I can put it up. And slideshow. Current slide. So, so Canada signs the accord, which is good news, right? October 5th, 2016. On December, Canada and 194 other countries reached the Paris Agreement, an ambitious, balanced agreement to fight climate change. This new agreement will strengthen the effort to limit the global average temperature rise to well below 2 degrees Celsius and pursue efforts to limit the increase to 1.5 degrees Celsius. And here on the right-hand portion of the slide, Canada is falling well short of its targets. And this research indicated that Canada is likely to miss its 2030 nationally determined contributions by 15 to 20%. And so you see this measure from critically insufficient on the one side to a role model, and we are deemed to be insufficient at this time. So, you know, promises and these accords are good, but action is better than words.
Thank you. Stephen, do you have anything to contribute to that question?
All I can contribute is about, you said 400,000. Last year we expected over 300,000. We got only 180 84,000 immigrants because of the pandemic. I do not believe this year we shall meet the target of 400,000 because of the ongoing pandemic.
Mm-hmm. Stephen, could I ask you about Canada's immigration laws as they apply to asylum seekers who arrive at our borders and at non-official border crossing areas? What is Canada's position on that and the people that want to just walk into Canada and when they get here, ask for asylum?
Yeah, Canada's border crossing situation is governed first by the Immigration and Refugee Protection Act. Then there's the Canada Border Services Agency Act. There's Canada Border Services Agency administers and enforces immigration and refugee protection regulations together with IRCC, Immigration, Refugee, Citizenship Canada. So it is these majorly which determine how people crossing are handled. According to the 1951 Convention and the Immigration and Refugee Protection Act, people seeking asylum are doing it legally. There's nothing illegal about it. All they have to be given a chance to do is to raise their case and see if the reasons they are seeking asylum for are credible. Another agreement which is involved in the asylum seeking is the Safe Third Country Agreement, which was signed in 2002. This agreement states that any asylum seeker who approaches either border at an official port of entry should be sent back to either USA or Canada. But if they enter each other's countries at unofficial crossing points, they should be given a chance to seek asylum. I believe Canada has a very strong refugee determination system. That is why the Immigration Refugee Board was put in place. They look at all cases, accept those that are credible. Those that are not credible are rejected. That is why we saw in November 2020, the government resumed deportations of some of those unsuccessful cases. Over 12,000 people were removed from Canada. That shows the system works. And this problem grew during the Trump presidency because he was anti-immigration. But now that we have a new administration in place, we are hoping for something better. In the past, between February 2017 and June 2020, 58,621 people crossed from the USA to Canada. That scares some people, but I think the system does work. They should be given a chance to state their cases. If they're not credible, they are sent back to where they came from.
So does the credibility of their cases include migration because of climate disruption, because their homeland is devastated?
No, it does not include. Though our climate migrants are not considered refugees according to the law, both Canadian law and international law.
Okay.
So they are still in a limbo.
Right.
We have to find a way of catering for them, but as of now, they can't claim refugee status.
Okay.
Yeah.
So who does look after those people who are on the move because of climate disruptions? I don't know if Rudy or Stephen can either of you.
I think the UN agencies come in, the World Health Program, the Food and Agriculture Organization, and then civil society, international civil society. They all step in to try and assist. But there is no laid down format of what can be done for them, I think.
Mm-hmm. So in the end, the best thing that we can do is to bring our own emissions down and help keep the worst of potential climate disasters from happening by doing our best to mitigate here and elsewhere.
That is the ultimate.
Okay.
That is the ultimate solution.
For decades, the Inuit leader and Nobel Prize nominee Stephen Kaduuli, who is also the author of The Right to Be Cold, has advised that we recognize a strong connection between human rights, the environment, health, society, and economics. Human rights protections, she says, should be built into our global climate agreements. How do you feel, Stephen and Rudy, that Canada as a society is able to recognize these truths that Stephen Kaduuli is talking about?
International migrants, of course.
Well, she's talking about human rights being built into climate change agreements.
Yeah, I believe she's very correct there. Because if you look at the Sahel region, climate change has combined with the violence due to dwindling resources in the Sahel area. Violence has combined with the climate change, and as a result, there are wars in that whole region. And the last I saw, 200 people had been forced to move. So I believe human rights should be intertwined with climate change.
Okay. Rudy, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, no, I think what's important to understand, I mean, that's a well kind of phrased or desire, but it depends on who's protecting those human rights. So I think it's good to establish what those rights are, but then who is being called upon to ensure that those rights are being preserved. And so if it is used in such a way that, so I think there has to be great care in terms of how it's crafted. I think, human rights are so vitally important. I see this even in my work in refugee resettlement as it comes to, and this is a little bit astray from climate change, but in terms of freedom of religion. We enjoy and some oftentimes take it for granted here in the West, but in many parts of the world, religious freedom, we see this in the Uyghurs in China, and including the Christian community in China as well, under tremendous persecution. And I think any opportunity we have to advocate for the protection of human rights, I think is an important step. But I think, we'd have to probably look at the details in terms of how that is phrased within the legislation.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And then we also have some Canadian companies which are involved in mining in places like Congo. They employ Congolese in very inhumane situations. Their mining operations lead to degradation of the environment. So I think it is all intertwined. We should bring in that human rights aspect as well.
Yeah, and I think that's a fabulous point, Stephen. But I would also go on to say that that protection of human rights has to be applied equally across the board. So simply to penalize Canadian organizations, and I think they should be kind of held to a standard of human right protection that Canadians enjoy. But that same standard should also be held and protected and held against the Chinese government.
Oh, yes, of course.
Right. So, I mean, so I think a level playing field is important when it comes to environmental protections as well as human right protection. So I think anything we can do to make sure that this is a level playing field across the board is absolutely important, vital.
Mm-hmm. I have a question for Rudy. Several people are asking something along the same lines. What advocacy efforts are on the way to lobby the government in recognizing that climate change is a reason for granting asylum in Canada?
Not that I know of. I know that the Migrants and Refugee section in their consultation related to climate change related displacement, they are proposing one of the discussion points on the table was, should the definition of a refugee be amended to include climate change related migration? And I think there's a limited latitude where that is possible. And I think Stephen, when he talked about those Pacific Island states that are now underwater, I think absolutely, we should expand the definition of refugees to include those specific examples. But I think there has to be great care when climate change drives migration within the same country, right? So when they become IDPs, I do not think that the definition of refugees should be expanded to include internally displaced climate change migration. And the reason being is that my fear is that it will dilute the definition of a refugee too greatly. So when I compare someone that is able to take, for example, and I know this is devastating for our northern Inuit communities that have to perhaps move to a different location in order, when rising sea levels has forced that migration. That is a terrible situation that they face and great suffering, but I don't want to put it at the same level as those that are fleeing for their life, right? So the Coptic Christians that were the 20 of them that were beheaded on the beach, that's the refugees that we need to protect, those that are fleeing for their life. So I'm fearful that there's an potential for dilution of that refugee term. But I'm not aware of any specific advocacy efforts, to answer the question, that are specifically advocating for that change within the Canadian context.
Okay, I think we have to wrap up the question portion now. We have a little bit more than 5 minutes left of our meeting. Maybe something to think about, and I'm just going to add a little bit of my own observation, though, is that people fleeing their home, I think their lives are what they are considering of protecting. I know that the level of violence may be different from one situation to another, but I think from my point of view, it is valid to expand, as you say, Rudy, the definition of refugee to include those whole countries who do not have any hope of recovering. Those people, and we will see more of them, need to receive consideration within our laws here in Canada and international laws. I don't know if that necessarily means diluting, but rather than diluting, I would include the word expansion and inclusion of people in need, in dire need of protecting their lives. I'm going to share my screen now and give you some information about some of the campaigns that are happening right now that we can take part in. So Stephen mentioned For Love of Creation. Unfortunately, through a webinar, all I can do is show you the links, and maybe some of my helpers can post them in the chat box for me, and that way you can grab them. There's a very important one
already
happening
in the chat.
tomorrow. It's already? Thank you very much. This one, there are 4 points that we are asking our Canadian government for, and you can read those on the website. What we'll take part in this afternoon is the Sacred People, Sacred Earth campaign, and the 5th of their 10 demands is hospitality. Welcoming migrants is a primary way of my faith showing that I love my neighbor. Citizens for Public Justice on their website has a lot of information about refugee rights and migrant rights. So they also provide information about migrant workers to Canada and how they are treated when they're here. And finally, something that GCCM Canada is often concerned about is what is happening with our Indigenous communities. And when I began planning for this webinar, I had thought to have an Indigenous person speak about how their life has changed in the Arctic because of climate change. But I realized after a little while of trying to find someone who could speak from that point of view that even my question was coming from a colonial point of view. We're here to help you. What help do you need? And what I realized in my research and reading more and hearing more of Wat Cloche's webinars and YouTube talks is that they don't necessarily want our help. They want us to learn from their resilience. So one thing that I would suggest is read her book, Free to Be Cold. But one of the things that she advocates for, and on behalf of all Indigenous peoples here in Canada and elsewhere in the world, is bringing into law the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And there is a faith group called Faith in the Declaration who is working hard to have Canada solidify this UN declaration into Canadian law. And the website for that is listed on the page here too. So I'm going to stop sharing. We have 16 people on the call. If any of you, I'm going to put us on gallery view from my computer right now. If anyone has prepared posters, this is the time that we're going to share them. And I am going to take my background off because my posters don't show up when I have a background. There we go. So, can I see a show of hands? How many people have a poster that we can, oh good, we have a few, yay! Okay, so let's get them all up on the screen. Oh, no, I don't know if I can do this. I need to, I'm gonna put them in my teeth. We all ready? 1, 2, 3. Okay, so I've done a screen capture, and I will send this along to people at the Sacred People, Sacred Earth. There are many events across Canada where people are participating in Sacred People, Sacred Earth. And one of them was one that I shared. I will send that back out in email later this afternoon as well. tomorrow at 11 o'clock is when most of these events are happening. But in the meantime, please check some of those other websites that we have available. And thank you very much for joining. Keep in touch. Check in with GCCM Canada. We have lots of things going on in the near future. Thank you very much, Rudy and Stephen, for your insights today. A pleasure. Thank you, Karen, Michelle, and Joe for assisting in the background. Have a great day. Enjoy our spring weather. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.